Dream cars. These are the cars that set our hearts racing, our imaginations reeling, and roped us into car shows to get a glimpse of what we thought the future would look like. Most never made it into production, but while they roamed the earth, they made us believe that anything was possible. It was a combination of science, technology, and hope, all thrown in to create a heady automotive mix, the dream cars. Today, car shows are big business. They attract millions of people around the world who come to get a glimpse of all the newest models. The automakers go to great lengths to excite the public about their new cars. This wasn't the case when cars were a novelty. The concept of powered transportation had tantalized human beings for centuries. Finally, in the 19th century, technical innovations actually started to make this a reality. Every car was experimental in those days. The parts weren't standardized and no one had a lock on how to make a reliable car. By the 1920s, automobiles were relatively reliable and durable. The public could buy cars that they could own and drive for a long time. This presented a problem for the manufacturers. People were holding on to their cars and not buying new ones. They came up with a plan to entice people to visit their showrooms: styling.
In the 20s, when the very, very start of styling originated in America, the country was dominated by pretty ordinary, pretty plain cars that had become very practical.
The chairman of General Motors, Alfred P. Sloan, is credited with developing the concept of planned obsolescence. He believed that annual styling changes would cause people to buy something new, even if there wasn't anything wrong with what they already had. It was also very cost-effective for the company.
To improve or to change the power trains in a car or the chassis underneath would be fairly expensive, but to make new metal stampings for the exterior of the car was relatively cheap.
Sloan decided Harley Earl would lead the styling charge. Earl was a young custom car designer in California who was making a name for himself creating cars for movie stars. Sloan ordered the head of Cadillac, Charles Fisher, to visit Earl and lure him to Detroit. Fisher offered Earl an assignment to develop the body style for Cadillac's new, small, more affordable car, the LaSalle. Earl loved the European car, the Hispano Suiza. His Hispano-inspired LaSalle stood out from the crowd.
In this era of the 20s, I can't convince you how dull those cars were in the 20s. To see this good-looking car out there, it's starting to be at a price that some people could afford it.
Sloan was happy with Earl's work and named him the first head of styling for any automaker.
So there was Mr. Earl. They'd hired him to do the first car for Cadillac, and they envisioned a line of cars for Cadillac, unlike anything that had ever been in the world. An 8-cylinder Cadillac, a 12-cylinder Cadillac, and a 16-cylinder Cadillac. Nothing had ever happened like that. That was to be a car that they were going to take around the world.
While Earl was settling in at General Motors, the stock market collapsed, sending the economy into a tailspin. Chinese philosophers have said there are two sides to chaos: danger and opportunity. The disastrous economy and resulting slack sales allowed Sloan to rely more on his new stylist. He reasoned that the company could save an enormous amount of money if it reduced the variety of chassis it built. He had Earl create the differences for the Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac brands through styling.
There would be a new car coming out of General Motors every year, not just for one division, but wherever that car was shared. In other words, it would be shared by Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile. So there'd be 3 new cars coming out. It was his responsibility that they looked different.
Ironically, as the economy continued its downward slide, plans were underway for a grand celebration of technology and the future. The World's Fair in 1933 would be a celebration of industrial design. It would attract more than 22 million people who came to marvel at this new world. Several car makers prepared special vehicles to show the crowd. Harley Earl jumped at the chance to exhibit there. His Cadillac designers created his first dream car for the event.
And it was a beautiful, long, graceful Cadillac V16 with a fastback coupe body on.
They had done others privately for themselves, but this was the first one that they showed to the public.
Some of the other car makers were a little more daring.
It wasn't just Cadillac that was showing cars. All the automobile companies had a special model represented there at the show as their feeling of the future.
The Pierce Arrow Silver Arrow was considered to be the most stunning car at the show.
The Pierce Arrow, the Silver Arrow, was at least 10 years ahead of its time. That configuration, the envelope body, was not seen in production until 1946.
Only 5 of these $10,000 cars were made. While too expensive for the masses, their streamlined styling created quite an impact.
They made people want cars in a time where people barely had enough money to put bread on the table, and they still wanted a new streamlined car.
Streamlined design was the rage, and Chrysler was sure they could create a winner, the airflow. The engineers, and even Walter Chrysler, were enamored with the advanced aerodynamic shape of the airflow.
Well, unfortunately, the car designers, formal car designers, didn't have that much to do with the design of the airflow. And the engineers really wanted the airflow to be aerodynamic. And they put a lot of work into wind tunnel testing and so on, and that determined the overall shape of the airflow.
Unfortunately, the airflow's radical styling didn't catch on.
Just because you do a far-out car that's very futuristic doesn't mean it's appropriate to sell at that particular moment. And I think Chrysler learned that lesson very expensively.
Chrysler's failure didn't deter others from continuing the search for what would shape the automotive future. Buckminster Fuller, later known for his geodesic domes, created a radical new vehicle, the Dymaxion. It had front-wheel drive, an engine in the back, and rear steering. Its unique three-wheel design enabled it to make 90-degree turns. Fuller loved to show off its abilities. He saw the Dymaxion as part of a whole way of life. He envisioned it as being able to be transformed into an airplane. These low-cost auto airplanes would allow people to move out of congested cities and populate inexpensive rural areas.
As a concept and as an idea, it was a great idea, and there was no precedent for it. I mean, it was original. It was good thinking, but as it turned out, it didn't turn out very well.
A tragic accident ended up killing one of his investors. The resulting bad publicity killed the Dymaxion. There were other dreamers trying to transform the automobile. In 1935, Bill Stout, the creator of the Ford Trimotor airplane, introduced his concept for the future. He called his bug-like car the Scarab.
It was an early version of the minivan. He had in it movable furniture, settees and armchairs that people could move around, tables that folded down out of the side. You could drive across country in one of these things and play cards or Monopoly the whole way if you wanted to do that.
The world wasn't ready for a minivan, and Stout's idea never caught on. This string of experimental failures didn't deter Rusty Hines, heir to the Hines catsup empire, from trying his hand at shaping the automotive future. His Phantom Corsair looked like a refugee from a science fiction film. Hines thought it would attract financial backers, but only one car had been built when Hines was killed in an auto accident. His dream project died with him. Back in Detroit, Harley Earl's reign as the king of style was under attack. Packard executives were the toast of the town in their sleek, boat-tailed convertibles. Edsel Ford liked the Packards and had his designers dream up a similar concept car for him. But Earl wasn't ready to give up his crown. In 1936, he unveiled the Y Job. The Y Job was much more than a dream car. Its ground-hugging, low profile and lack of running boards made it a design that mattered. Once again, Earl was king of the hill.
Cars in the brass era were tall, skinny, and short, so that the more modern you got, the lower and longer and wider a car had to become, because that was the direction of the future.
It was a foot lower than everything else on the road. And Mr. Earl was a foot higher than everybody else, and we stood by that car. It was to his knees.
The Y Job was far more than a technical exercise. It was an actual working car that Earl drove every day. It was a breathtaking car with its hidden headlights and aircraft-inspired shape. Earl believed that every part of the car should work in perfect harmony, like a symphony.
When Mr. Earl used that as his personal car, it was a sentinel for the styling department, and I think the corporation they loved it.
General Motors was so impressed, they made him vice president of styling. It was clear that the other car companies needed to create a little magic of their own. After the demise of the Airflow, Chrysler wanted to prove that it could produce something exciting. It built 6 cars called the Thunderbolts and Newports in 1940. They were put on display in dealerships where people flocked to see these visions of the future. The Y Job, the Thunderbolts, and the Newports signaled that the dark days of the Depression were over. They made people feel good after years of dismal news and hard times. Unfortunately, the promise of prosperity would have to be put on hold. The world was soon embroiled in an all-out war. When the war ended, Detroit was 4 years behind the times. The cars that were available were rehashed 1941 models, and the public wanted to put the horror of war behind them and start rebuilding their lives. Earl lost no time creating something new to replace the Y Job. He was in love with the burgeoning jet age, and as a salute to flying, he created the LeSabre. The LeSabre was loaded with every technological innovation that GM's engineers could cram into one car. An all-aluminum body, power top with a rain detector, a remote scanning rearview mirror, and more made it a rolling laboratory. The car debuted on the cover of Life magazine and then Motor Trend. It was an instant hit with the public. People marveled at its wraparound windshield, bucket seats, and low-slung profile. Earl loved to drive the car and kept a mechanic on the payroll to ensure that its complicated systems were working. No one is sure how much the car cost, but $500,000 is a safe guess. That would be over $5 million today. Earl's creation caused such a stir that plans were soon made to have his staff develop a series of dream cars for an upcoming show of General Motors products and technology. His team now had to create stunning, awe-inspiring cars that would draw in the crowds. This turned into a 24-hour-a-day non-stop marathon. People slept at the styling studios. Earl had a kitchen set up that served food night and day. Nothing could get in the way of the dream car builders. General Motors hoped the Motoramas would pump up post-war demand and draw people into its dealerships. They wanted this to be the biggest show anyone had ever seen.
General Motors, and as well as the United States, were feeling euphoric. And what they did is this was a no holds barred. There was no budget limitations. There was no constraints. It was just as big and as huge as it could be.
The dream cars were the centerpiece, but the public would be mesmerized by Broadway singers, dancers, and musicians. There was a buzz in New York as the city waited for the doors of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to open and let them in to see the wonders of the Motorama. Finally, on January 23rd, showtime. The crowds poured in to finally get a look at the dream cars. It was more than anyone could have expected. Earl's dreamers had built a car for each of GM's divisions. Oldsmobile showed off the glass fiber-bodied Starfire, one of 4 glass fiber-bodied cars at the show. Buick unveiled the companion car to Earl's LeSabre, the XP300. It was packed with the same wild technology, but didn't have the style that made Earl's car stand out. Cadillac's Le Mans gave the public a glimpse of what was to come. It had hooded headlamps, wraparound windshield, and tail fins. It was long, low, and powerful. Everything Earl loved. The number 1 stunner was a little sports car that Earl had prepared for Chevrolet. The public loved it. The demand was so great that GM decided to turn the dream car into a reality. The show even featured displays of some high-tech developments GM was working on.
In addition to the cars, there were displays for engines. They would have cutaways of the engines that would fold out so you could see the internals. There were displays of transmission operation and how seats are made, and it would give the spectator an inside view of how these vehicles were constructed, why things were the way they were, and did it in an entertaining fashion.
The commotion created by the Motoramas wasn't lost on the competition. Virgil Exner, Chrysler's head of design, didn't have the money to compete head-on with Earl. He took another approach, subtle, Italian-inspired style.
They were doing things that the Americans were not. Smaller cars, more organic cars, much less ornamentation, just more beautiful forms. And Exner appreciated that and tried to blend the American form with the Italian.
It was very clean, it was very pure. It was this wonderful blend of this early 50s Italianate feel that you begin to get a look at in the Cisitalia. You begin to get a feel for it in some of the Ferraris of the era.
Ford took another tack and tried to outdo Earl with their Atmos. Its bubble top, large fins, pointed bumpers, and tight wheel wells didn't excite the public like Earl's cars had. They kept trying. The Lincoln Futura kept the bubble top theme alive, and its heavily lidded eyes added a note of mystery. While it didn't influence production design, it did become famous when it was used as the Batmobile in a television series. Not to be outdone, Earl took his cars into the jet age with the Firebirds, a series of gas turbine, jet-inspired cars. The XP-21, or experimental Firebird, was modeled on the Douglas Skyray supersonic jet. The Firebird II continued Earl's fascination with jets and the coming space age. It was an irresistible vision that resonated with the public. They introduced this land rocket on the main stage of the Motorama with a sci-fi family film. This was the era of the nuclear family, and GM wanted to show that it would transport the public into a friendly future.
Hey, you want some ice cream or a cool drink?
Orange juice, please. Me too.
I'm gonna go for the ice cream.
Nothing was too hot for the public. They loved it. They'd been watching that car of the future on Popular Science magazine and coming to their new home that was going to be there, and there'll be an airport and a landing strip in the front, and the airplane will park there and the car will park there. If you didn't have an airplane, you hoped the car looked like an airplane. So it was a great time. It was naive, but it was a wonderful time.
It was a complete and compelling vision of modern life. Technology was the playful servant that would liberate our lives. There were no downsides.
Firebird 2 to Control Tower. We are about to take off on the highway of tomorrow. Stand by.
The future had no traffic jams, no smog, no accidents, only happy, affluent people. Across town, Virgil Exner's sleeker, leaner cars were creating a stir. While they didn't look as futuristic as Earl's designs, Exner would soon influence the shape of tomorrow. In 1957, Exner and Chrysler unveiled their forward look. Suddenly, GM designers felt like they were living in the past.
We were driving down Mound Road and saw some of the new products parked out in their lot by the factory, and we were shook up. It was unbelievable.
As the GM stylists worked on the Firebird 3, they began to hatch a plan to counteract Exner's designs. Earl was close to retirement, and power was up for grabs.
We actually had a little bit of an insurrection there at Styling when he was over in Europe, and we had seen those Chryslers. We all started a new car. Every studio had the one Mr. Earl was asking for, and then a new one standing beside it. And Bill Mitchell has taken over, and he allowed us to do that.
It was a signal that Earl had lost his touch with the times.
There are things we appreciate that kids don't appreciate because we're stuck in time, and things that kids appreciate that we don't appreciate because they're moving on.
GM's Firebird 3 took Earl's jet age styling to the extreme, but it proved to be too much, too late. Times were changing, tastes were changing, and what had once seemed new and innovative was beginning to look a bit silly.
In 1961, there was just the GM Firebird 3 as the showcase for the experimental vehicle, and most of the other vehicles were production cars.
As the dream car era drew to an end, General Motors ordered that the show cars be destroyed.
By and large, many of the vehicles, especially the fiberglass-bodied cars, were all scheduled to be destroyed, and many of them actually were destroyed to satisfy the corporate edict.
Some were broken up or left to rust away in junkyards. Others were kept safe by a few who didn't want the dream to die. While most have been accounted for, there are some still waiting to be found.
Who knows what's out there? There's still a lot more vehicles, I believe, that are hidden away in barns or in some other capacity made it out of General Motors and away from the crusher, so they're out there.
As the cars began to reappear, manufacturers were inspired once again to push the limits in their show car designs.
I believe personally that it is important for people to use their imaginations because I think it helps to shape future offerings, and also it's just the progression of technology and design. It requires it.
If we ever lose that spark that made America what it was and made that automobile industry what it was, it would be an awful shame. I don't think we will. I think there'll be dreamers in every society.
The concept cars of today are direct descendants of the dreamers who dared to push the limits of our imagination. They conjured up visions of the future that gave us hope. They made us believe the best was yet to come.